Good morning to us. Good evening to Naomi. Um, I have the pleasure of telling you a little bit about Naomi Ragen, who is our author today of the book, The Enemy Beside Me. She is an American Israeli author. She's a journalist, in fact, had been a columnist for the Jerusalem Post and a playwright. She was born in New York City. She grew up in Queens, attended an Orthodox Jewish day school before she received her bachelor degree in literature from Brooklyn College. In 1971, she moved to Jerusalem with her husband. In 1978, she received a master's degree in literature from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Probably most importantly, she has 4 children, 13 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. She's an outspoken advocate for women's rights in Israel, waging campaigns against domestic abuse, gender segregation on Israeli buses, as well as a bias in rabbinical courts. She's an active combatant against anti-Israel and anti-Semitic propaganda through her website. In addition to her internationally best-selling novels, of which this book, The Enemy Beside Me, is number 13, she also wrote a hit play that was commissioned by the Israeli National Theater. The play was entitled Women's Minion. That was in 2001, is when it was first performed. It's been performed over 600 times, if you can imagine, in Israel, and as she said to me, is playing there even as we speak. It's also been performed in the United States and in Argentina. As I stated before, this book is her 13th publication. And last month, Ruth Weiss, who is a noted educator, a Harvard professor, selected Naomi's book, our book, as one of the best books of 2023 in Mosaic magazine. It's great pleasure and pride that I get to introduce you to Naomi Ragen.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. I don't know what I expected when I published The Enemy Beside Me, my 13th novel, and the most difficult, and heartbreaking, and infuriating, and perhaps the most important of all my books. I think I had a modest goal to pull from obscurity the hidden pockets of Holocaust distortion and anti-Semitism that have really gone under Jewish radar until now. As Douglas Murray recently wrote, we can all become wanderers in a lost civilization if our memory goes. But what I certainly did not expect was that my book was going to be born into an all-out anti-Semitic genocidal war that has engulfed the entire world, if not in practice, then in theory. A war supported not only by the usual suspects like the Ayatollahs and Palestinian terror groups, but also Harvard College professors, students at NYU and Cornell, congresswomen, newscasters, and journalists from respected mainstream media. That such is the case is absolutely flabbergasting. The Enemy Beside Me, it seems to me now, is more important than I thought it was, because vitally it reminds decent people what happens to civilized countries taken over by mindless mobs, fed by ignorance and prejudice and nourished by slogans instead of facts, violent temper tantrums instead of reason. It underscores how easily people can be manipulated to laud, support, and eventually participate in even the vilest and most unspeakable acts of barbarism in the name of some vague ideal. If urged by enough slick videos and surgically enhanced influencers wearing designer clothes, what things will young people today have the courage and intelligence to reject? Not much, I suspect. The way once millions of ordinary people mesmerized by Nazi uniforms and pageantry mass murdered millions. To a frightening degree, the lessons of the Holocaust have not been learned, have not been internalized. Why did I decide to focus on Lithuania? Because Lithuania killed a higher percentage of its Jews than any other country in Europe, including Nazi Germany, and that he did it before the Germans even arrived. But more importantly, because today, Lithuania is the leading proponent of Holocaust distortion in Europe, honoring the perpetrators, dishonoring the mass graves, and seeking to create a new false narrative that will wipe out any gains Holocaust education in Europe has achieved over the last 70 years. As much as all of us want to put that horrible chapter of our history behind us, reality now makes that impossible. Now, more than ever, we cannot remain deaf and blind to the dishonoring of our dead and the miseducation of the living, bestowing upon Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and the Ukraine a status they have not earned and do not deserve as enlightened Europeans who have learned from their past and repented, must be stopped. The time has come to take a united stand against such stupendous, wrong-headed choices. This is my 13th book. As those of you who are familiar with my other novels probably realize, this book is not my usual subject matter, which is the lives of religious Jewish women. Yet writing about the Holocaust was something I felt obligated to do for decades. In fact, about 20 years ago, I actually tried. I knew exactly what my book was going to be about, the experiences of my mother-in-law, all those stories she told me under flickering Shabbat candles in the hushed quiet of Friday night as we both waited for our husbands to come home from shul. How it had been for her, a girl of 14, when the Nazis showed up in Ungvar, a town in the Carpathian Mountains, beating her mentally challenged brother almost to death when he dared ask questions. The overcrowded brick factory where thousands waited for the cattle cars. The final moments at the gates of Auschwitz, where she caught the last glimpse of her parents, her grandmother and brother. And then more slowly, over many, many Friday nights, how she and her two sisters and friends had managed against all odds to survive, the trade-offs for crumbs, the imaginary meals they cooked to keep from going mad with hunger. With my father-in-law, it was more complicated. Forcibly drafted into the Jewish slave labor force serving the deeply anti-Semitic Hungarian army, while he was forcibly serving as cannon fodder, they rounded up his young wife and two small children and gassed them in Auschwitz. It was a story he couldn't talk about. Even my husband only found out about his father's first family at age 18 when his father suddenly thrust an old photo of a pretty dark-haired woman, a handsome little boy, and a curly-headed little girl into his hands. It was traumatizing. Until I read Robert Rosette's book, Conscripted Slaves, I had no idea that my father-in-law's survival had been a miracle. As one of 45,000 Jewish men who had suffered from the spring of 1942 until the summer of 1944, 80% of whom never went home, he had beaten the odds. I just couldn't imagine how. Had it been any other topic, as a professional novelist, I would simply have used my imagination. I would have made things up. I know that there are authors of Holocaust novels out there who do exactly that, playing fast and loose with the truth, like the tattooist of Auschwitz that turns out not to be true at all. But that seems to me to be a travesty because there are still so many doubters, so much misinformation, and most of all, there are so many true stories that have yet to be told. Why would you make something up? To me, our people's experiences in the Holocaust are sacred and need to be related with scrupulous honesty. So I let the book idea go, thinking that maybe one day I'd ask my father-in-law all the questions that I had. That day never came. And so I put aside all my index cards and I went on to other projects. That didn't mean I stopped searching for answers. Ironically, all those years later, after having seen so many films and read so many memoirs and books of history, I felt almost as ignorant as I did back then. I'm not alone. The Holocaust, as author and scholar Melvin Julius Bouquet, is a black hole that devours light. The more illumination you cast on it, the less you see. He also wrote, no one can understand how we can hold collectively guilty not only the octogenarian perpetrators, but the rest of the nation that saw nothing for the 12-year reign of the Thousand-Year Reich, and their children and grandchildren, and the yet unborn, tainted by their German blood, wrote Bouquet in the preface to his remarkable collection of second-generation Holocaust writings, Nothing Makes You Free. He goes on to say, because the pure flame of undying hatred is wrong, doesn't mean that it isn't true. And if this reflects a deep flaw in my soul, so be it. They put it there. A long time, I think, for a very long time, I agreed with him. I seethed with anger and hatred on behalf of every victim. And then, 3 years ago, during COVID, I happened to meet an old friend walking down a nearly deserted street in Jerusalem. Dr. Ephraim Zoroff, head of Israel's Weizsäll Center and a renowned Nazi hunter. We stopped briefly to chat, and in those few moments, he related some information that I found so shocking that it upended everything that I thought I knew. He had co-authored a nonfiction book entitled Our People, in which he detailed an almost unknown story of how local Lithuanians, farmers, butchers, policemen, savagely and sadistically murdered and looted almost every single Jewish man, woman, and child in the country, over 96% of their 600-year-old Jewish community. Traveling around Lithuania, gathering information from local people, he had joined up with a best-selling Lithuanian author, Ruth Vanagata, to produce a remarkable historical document. Then he told me this. He, who had spent his life seeking justice for Holocaust victims, whose namesake had been killed by Lithuanian perpetrators collaborating with the Nazis, had nevertheless managed to develop a friendship with this Lithuanian woman, probably the offspring of perpetrators, a friendship which had deepened into love. He had gone through a divorce and they were thinking of getting married. I was flabbergasted. When Germans shipped off their Jews, putting their torture and murder into the hands of strangers far from prying eyes, and even Himmler had expressed reservations about murdering German Jews, in Lithuania there had been no such niceties. As the first permanent testimonies of survivors collected by Lev Kornichowski after the war confirm in chilling detail, almost too horrible to read, in the recently published The Lithuanian Slaughter of Its Jews, in every tiny town and village in Lithuania, the murderers of Jews were their own neighbors, who did it minutes from home, who committed murder, rape, and looting with shameless abandon, holding public parties to divide the spoils. Nothing was too small to give out, not a pair of underwear or a teaspoon. As survivors testified, even the Nazis who witnessed this behavior expressed disgust. I imagine the example set by the Lithuanians so inspired Hitler that 6 months later, on January 20th, 1942, he and his henchmen held the Wannsee Conference, adopting mass murder of the Jewish people as official Nazi policy, apparently now convinced killing every Jew in Europe would be a walk in the park. After all, look what happened in Lithuania. Ironically, years before I knew any of these things, I had visited Vilnius. I was researching a book about the first Hebrew novelist, a Lithuanian woman named Sarah Foner. Surrounded by Jewish heritage tourists eager to visit ancestral villages, I experienced a shock when our kippah-wearing group tried to buy soft drinks at a local kiosk after visiting a large, imposing, abandoned synagogue in what was obviously once a thriving Jewish community. We were treated like lepers. Later, as I sat on a bench in a leafy park opposite Vilnius's Jewish quarter, I watched in horror as a white marble gravestone rose out of the earth in the grass after the rain, revealing that the park was planted over a cemetery. Even more upsetting was the priceless Jewish landmarks like the great synagogue Schulhof complex, which had disappeared completely, callously destroyed by the Soviets, who put up ugly housing complexes and parking lots. After gaining independence, Lithuanians had done absolutely nothing to restore or commemorate these Jewish sites. They continued paving over and building anew, only stopped by the most extreme public outcries, like that against the new convention center. Just recently, this happened, that was poised to be built over the Jewish cemetery. And yet, Dr. Zoroff's personal story, it revealed to me in the middle of a Jerusalem street, was one that flew in the face of unending hatred, revealing forgiveness, reconciliation, even love was possible, even for someone like himself who had dedicated his life to finding justice for the victims. I was startled and I was inspired by his example and incredibly moved by the collaboration of Zoroff and Vinogata in bravely bringing the unpopular truth of Lithuania's Holocaust crimes, long denied and distorted by official government agencies to this day, to popular recognition. As a best-selling Lithuanian author and a respected national celebrity, Ruta Vinogata had so much to lose. And indeed, she paid a terrible price because Ephraim Zoroff was considered public enemy number one in Lithuania, and her joining together with him made her an enemy. She was dumped by her editor, her agent, and her publishing house. Her popular books were snatched off the shelves of bookstores. Her livelihood was destroyed. On occasion, she even faced physical attacks. Today, Ruta sends us Facebook messages from her new home in Spain. She has burnt her bridges. She did it out of the love of truth and her own very special, I think, kind of patriotism, the desire to make her country a place her children could be proud of. As an author, I was shocked and moved to tears by Ephraim and Ruta's story. It is so brave, so remarkable, so uplifting, and so heartbreaking. But most importantly, it has the kind of complexity that only a full-length novel can properly explore. For not only is it about irredeemable evil, but also about penitence and remorse, forgiveness and reconciliation. What separates it from almost every other novel out there about the Holocaust is that it isn't only historical, but contemporary. It's about our generation, a subject really touched upon in Holocaust literature, with the bonus of being a love story with deeply sympathetic characters whose relationship faces unbelievable challenges and obstacles, people you care about and who you want to succeed despite impossible odds. And so I created the characters of Israeli Nazi hunter Milja Gottstein-Laskel and Lithuanian professor Darius Vidas. When Darius invites Milja to take part in a Holocaust education project in Lithuania, she's skeptical about the sincerity of him and his organization, given his country's history. She decides to come anyway because of her own secret agenda. She is planning to circumvent official Lithuanian channels, using her platform to reveal to Lithuanian high school students the truth that they have been denied concerning the true history of what took place in their own hometowns. Dr. Vidas is aware that he's putting his successful career in jeopardy by inviting Milja, who is a controversial Nazi hunter and a well-known critic of Lithuania. She's considered a friend of Putin. That's what they always say when they want to destroy your reputation. They say that about Ephraim Zoroff. He's a friend of Putin. But believing himself to be the grandchild of a Lithuanian mayor who saved a Jewish family, now living in America, he feels that he can change her mind about the country and its culpability. Little does he realize Milja's true agenda, that he really is putting not only himself and his academic career on the line, but he's also placing the rest of his family into the crosshairs of Lithuanian government officials who, at all costs, are determined to distort Holocaust history and bury Lithuanian participation in mass murder. Both Milja and Darius are in their late 40s with grown children and complicated personal lives. Both are passionately interested in the truth. Milja and Darius's journey, much like Zoroff and Vinogata's, begins with antagonism and irreconcilable differences. But the more they learn about each other and the past, the more the distance between them shrinks, until they find themselves joining together to battle forces that threaten them both, and not only them, singularly, but everything they love, everything they believe in, everything they hope to accomplish. What I, as a novelist, particularly wanted to explore in The Enemy Beside Me was how the characters crossed the abyss which still divides our generation and our children's and our grandchildren's. So many in the world today, Jew and non-Jew, struggle with the horrors that are the legacy of our history. I mean, all of us were born after this happened, right? What pioneering roadmap did Ephraim and Ruth's story create that we can follow, allowing us to follow in their footsteps to reach true reconciliation, even love, without betraying our loyalty to the victims or the love of our birthplaces? What balm could be applied to the terrible wound inflicted on human decency by the Nazis and their collaborators, a wound which still festers today, dividing people, making it impossible for all of us to move on now and for the foreseeable future? For those of us who had not been there, who had not participated, and whose suffering and culpability were bitter legacies passed down to us as history and cultural heritage, what is the way forward? I didn't know. And as a writer, I have found that the best way to figure out what I think about any question is to write a book about it. And so I began my work on The Enemy Beside Me. At the start, I thought that the way to begin would be to research the Holocaust in Lithuania. But after much unbearable plowing through book after book on this subject, I began to understand that what stands in the way of reconciliation between Jew and non-Jew is not the past, but the present. Crimes being committed today by official government bodies in Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and the Ukraine. Because of my meeting with Dr. Zoroff, I decided to concentrate on Lithuania, where virulent right-wing nationalist forces continue to protest and deny the well-documented historical facts about the responsibility of the Lithuanian people for the mass murder of almost their entire Jewish community. Today, Lithuanians are so invested in keeping up this self-deception that despite not being a wealthy country, they pour huge amounts of money they can ill afford into maintaining state-sponsored institutions whose sole purpose is Holocaust fixing, hiding and distorting shameful historical truths from the world, and especially their own children. For example, their Genocide and Resistance Research Center, which only researches Soviet crimes against Lithuanians. The Center for Historical Truth, or the Red Brown Commission, whose mission is to make Lithuanian suffering under Stalin equivalent to the crimes of the Holocaust. The outrageously named Genocide Museum, which has not a single exhibit on the Holocaust. So loud was the outcry against that egregious affront that the museum recently underwent a reluctant name change to the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights. Not exactly mellifluous, but that's what they did. So hell-bent is the Lithuanian government in accomplishing this massive fraud that they're willing to destroy decades of Holocaust education in Europe by promoting their double genocide theory, which ridiculously equates the systematic, industrialized mass murder of Europe's Jews to the confiscation of businesses and deportations of the Soviet communists. As I wrote in my book, it wasn't us, the Lithuanian officials told whoever was listening. It was the Germans. It wasn't us. It was the communists. It wasn't us. It was just a few bad apples. And besides, haven't we also suffered? Didn't the communists, many of them Jews, take away our farms and our businesses? Didn't they execute our partisans, exile us to Siberia in the thousands, where we starved and died? Why? It was exactly the same as the Holocaust, they'll tell you. And now they declare we're even. As part of the EU, Lithuania is in a position to influence all of Europe with its Holocaust distortions. Indeed, equating the crimes of the communists to the final solution almost became official EU policy in 2008 with the Prague Declaration, which went under the radar for most Jewish organizations who continue to happily send representatives to Lithuania to be honored and to get medals for not rocking the boat instead of demanding change. Luckily, Some Jews were not sleeping. Ephraim Zorov was an outspoken critic, and Lithuania-based Jewish author, scholar, and educator David Katz, once a professor of Yiddish at Vilnius University before he got fired for his activism, helped put together the 70 Years Declaration co-authored by Professor Danny Ben Moshe of Deakin University in Melbourne, who gathered the signatures of 70 EU parliamentarians who categorically rejected attempts to, quote, obfuscate the Holocaust by diminishing its uniqueness and deeming it to be equal, similar, or equivalent to communism, as suggested by the 2008 Prague Declaration. Lithuania's Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time was outraged. He called it, quote, deplorable and pathetic, and he declared it is not possible to find differences between Hitler and Stalin, except in their mustaches. Hitler's was shorter. Crime number 2 standing in the way of reconciliation, forgiveness between us today is the hero worship of so-called partisans who opposed the communists but were also mass murderers of Jews, like Jonas Noreka, whose own granddaughter, Sylvia Foti, recently denounced him in her book, My Grandfather the Nazi. But this hero worship of murderous anti-Semites isn't limited just to Noreka. Bestowal of state awards to perpetrators like J. Kristaponis and Abel Tusis, the naming of streets and schools, not only after Noreka, but also Nazi collaborator Skirpa. And let's not forget to mention the government-funded reburial of the head of the 1941 Nazi collaborationist government, who initiated the persecution of Jews, not merely by promulgating the infamous statutes on the position of Jews, but by paying the salaries of thousands of executioners who shot Jews at Kaunas' 7th Fort. In 2018, to celebrate Vilnius' 100th birthday, hundreds marched through the streets with banners reading, "We know who our heroes are," with the images of partisan Jew killers. Crime number 3 is the refusal to try war criminals. Although thousands of Lithuanians took part in the murder of their neighbors, not a single one was tried and convicted and jailed. Indeed, when 15 Lithuanians were deported from the United States for war crimes, they dusted off their Lithuanian passports and headed for Vilnius. And instead of embracing this as an opportunity for a national catharsis, to educate a new generation to the mistakes of the past and to disassociate an independent Lithuania from these criminals and their crimes, Lithuania instead embraced them, encouraging popular sentiment to vilify and deplore those persecuting these, quote, poor old men, and using their justice system to slow down the trials until these mass murderers died unpunished of old age. On the other hand, the Lithuanian prosecutor general showed no such reluctance in energetically pursuing Jewish anti-Nazi resistance fighters, including the former head of Yad Vashem, Yitzhak Garat, for so-called crimes. As Sarah Gennati, a native of Kaunas who escaped into the forest and joined the anti-Nazi fighters, wrote, she said, Jews did not join the anti-Nazi partisans as a normal act of choice. We were forced to fight the Lithuanian Nazis to save ourselves from extermination. We took the gun in our hands in a desperate situation when our parents, our brothers and sisters were murdered, when children were grabbed from their mothers and sent to gruesome deaths. We fought in order to survive. We fought against fascism, which was our enemy and the enemy of all democratic forces and the enemy of Lithuania. Crime 4 is reparations. The value of Jewish property in pre-war Lithuania has never been calculated. The public religious buildings alone were estimated to be worth $155 million. The compensation law for public property of 2011 set aside only $53 million to be paid out over 10 years. It was unclear who, if anybody, got this money. Nothing was allocated for the compensation of private property until last year, with Lithuania passed a law to set aside $38 million for private claims. This is a joke, but still it's been hailed with great enthusiasm, particularly by Jewish organizations. However, we have yet to see if bureaucratic measures that made it impossible In the past, for the descendants of Lithuanian Jewish victims to apply for compensation, if these problems will be overcome, things like proof of citizenship, what they will require, which is almost impossible to acquire based on heritage. So let's not pop any champagne corks just yet. Crime number 5, commemoration. There are 227 mass murder sites in Lithuania. Many, if not most, are unmarked and difficult to find. And even those that have special markers, like the Ninth Fort in Kaunas, where 50,000 Jews were murdered, project unclear messages that leave visitors picnicking and frolicking and having weddings. They're oblivious of its horrific history. Most sites remain unmarked at all, and an unmarked site is history paved over and forgotten, the voices of the victims forever stilled. While the enemy beside me contains historical material, it is not a book of history, nor even a historical novel. For the first time, I try to define what it means to be part of this new narrative, what we need to do to honor the victims and prevent the lingering hatefulness of the perpetrator's ideology from gaining momentum and exerting its power ever again. This is more important than ever today. I don't have to explain to you why. In this book, I face the difficult question of what the post-Holocaust relationship should be between the children of victims and those of the perpetrators. Can we, should we automatically hate entire generations of innocent people born long after these crimes took place? But on the other hand, should we raise our hands in defeat and simply acquiesce to the uncomfortable, virtue-signaling notion that we should forgive and forget because it happened so long ago? Many, perhaps most, would like to do just that. Many have even tried, but 80 years later, it still hangs over us like pollution. It's a cloud that often obscures the reality of our present, our safe, joyous lives as Jews. At some point, don't all of us stand like the Jews of Israel during the moment of silence when the siren sounds on Holocaust Remembrance Day, reflecting on the unthinkable tragedy and evil that happened to those we love, our people, trying to get our heads around it? Like it or not, like October 7th, it's now part of our lives, and no doubt part of the heritage we'll pass down to our children and grandchildren. I haven't done a survey, but from my personal experience today, decades after I first wanted to write about the Holocaust, so many books and movies and television shows and documentaries, they're even more numerous than ever and show no signs of slowing down, quite the opposite. Why would that be? And this is the conclusion I've reached. Despite being arguably the worst crime in human history, the perpetrators basically got away with it. Except for the handful of Nazi criminals who got hung after the Nuremberg trials, the great majority, who were no better and arguably much worse, who planned and executed the final solution, got off. If not completely scot-free, then with a slap on the wrist. That fact just doesn't sit right with intelligent, educated people, not only Jews, young people especially who are so concerned with social justice, with overcoming racism, prejudice, find it almost impossible to come to terms with these facts. And so the search for answers goes on, getting stronger instead of weaker, people writing more books, making more films. With all these important issues still standing between us, do I believe that reconciliation is still possible? This is what my book is really about. And in short, the answer is yes. Let me read to you a short conversation between Milya and Darius, which encapsulates my thoughts on this issue. So tell me, honestly, is it possible to make amends, or is it a lost cause? Is the hatred between our people so deep, so ingrained, that all this, he waved his hand, is a waste of time? I don't know, she fondly whispered, shaking her head. Maybe it is a waste of time. So, do you want to turn the car around and call the whole thing off? I'll get you on the next flight out tonight. She stared at him. Then she saw it, a sunbeam, glinting off the moisture in his eyes as two tears fell down his cheeks. She felt a sudden sense of deep shame. From the beginning, he had come to her with an open heart, while hers had been resolutely locked against him, against this whole enterprise. No, I don't want that. So what is it you do want, Milja? She was a Jew, a descendant of Holocaust victims and survivors, people who had been marked for extermination and left to suffer the unspeakable amid a suddenly uncivilized world whose humanity developed slowly over centuries through religion and education had abruptly and inexplicably disappeared overnight. But she herself had not suffered. She had not been born into suffering, but into freedom and prosperity, and most of all, her own country. Her generation turning back the clock, making Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people once more. Her position was one of strength, she told herself. She could now take her rightful place among other good, civilized people of the world, reaching across age-old barriers to heal old wounds, to create a new world, a better world. With people like Darius on the other side of the divide, it suddenly seemed possible. What I want, she said slowly, is to change the world so that what happened then can never happen again. That's what I want to, he said, exactly that. Are there enough of us to matter? What? Enough people like us on both sides of the divide, people who admit what happened in all its truth, people of goodwill, who care desperately enough to create this new world. I don't know, he admitted, but if there aren't, we need to create them. That is what we're doing now, Milja, you and I, attempting to create that world by transforming both our people, one by one by one. It is difficult, if not impossible, to write about things no one really understands, crimes for which the normal imagination halts at the threshold, holding back before entering, not wanting to believe our fellow human beings are capable of such things. And yet, the more we hold back, the more the voices of the victims fade, become unclear, indistinct, until they finally lapse into silence. If we allow that to happen, then the voices of the enemies still beside us will ramp up in volume, distorting the historical facts of the greatest crime in history beyond recognition. And those of you who have been watching your television sets and your news programs know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about those voices ramping up and distorting the truth. They've already begun their cacophony, rewriting history to obfuscate, excuse, distort, and lull us into acceptance. What they want us to believe is that it wasn't so bad. Such things happen in all wars, and all people of the world suffered equally, or perhaps even worse. What they want us to do is to forget that there ever was a Holocaust. This, all good people of the world must not allow. Those people of goodwill like Ruta Vanagata and Sylvia Foti and many good Lithuanians who are standing beside us, shoulder to shoulder in this battle, are our friends, whatever their parents and grandparents did or did not do. While Milja Gotskin, Latsker, and Darius Vidas are both fictional characters, their spirits are real and live on in all people whose histories have made them enemies, burdened by crimes committed before they were born. While historical truths cannot be ignored or overlooked and should never be distorted or denied, it is up to the living to make peace with one another. We must never be deaf to the voice of our dead, and yet we must also be open to the living hands reaching out in friendship and a sincere desire to make amends. Thank you very much. I hope you'll read my book.
Thank you, Naomi. I'll now turn the program over to Robin, who will ask some questions that we had heard previously. And there's a couple in the chat. If other people have questions in the chat, please feel free to put them in there. Thank you.
Naomi, thank you. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Let me start with something that actually wasn't on my list, but you mentioned it. How much of a, if you know, how much of a Jewish population is in Lithuania today?
I don't know. I think it's in the hundreds.
Is there
Certainly,
any is
it's
there
a
any
very
move?
small number. I haven't really checked, but maybe there are 2,000 Jews in Lithuania.
So they're not capable, or are they doing anything to further what you've talked about?
I think that the Jews of Lithuania are sort of captive. They
I'm sorry, I
don't
didn't hear you.
boat. They're captives. They don't want to rock the boat. They know that they're surrounded by hostile forces, and I think that they are unwilling to confront the government. And
And they can't.
I think what needs to be done is for Jews outside the country, because the Lithuanian government is very interested in Jewish tourism. They spend a great deal of time and effort and money trying to attract Jewish tourists because there are many Jews with historical ties to Lithuania. They're heritage tourists. And so they have programs which are, they call Lithuania the Jerusalem of the East. And they invite you to 100-year anniversaries of the Vilna Gaon. And they do all this without changing anything in their lauding of Holocaust perpetrators, the fact that they don't mark graves, the fact that they don't give back property. They do all this. They expect Jews to come, to spend their money, to take their vacations there, and to contribute to the economy of Lithuania, leaving the status quo the way it is. And I think that Jews outside the country have tremendous power in saying, no, we're not coming. Not until you make some changes. This is not happening. You're not attracting Jewish tourists. And I think there are many Jewish organizations that are so eager and willing to run to Lithuania to get a medal and to be feted in some kind of award ceremony and to shake hands, and they're willing to sell out all of the things that are important to Jews by cooperating with this fictive presentation of what happened during World War II, and to keep quiet about it in order to get their prize. And I complain equally about the Israeli government, who I think is completely complicit in this and has not wanted to rock the boat with Lithuania for years and has not done its part. Although recently I did see that there was the head of Yad Vashem went to the Lithuanian Seimas, which is their legislative body, their Congress, and he let them have it. He said everything that I said. So maybe there is a change coming. I don't know. But more voices have to be raised, and more Jews have to say, no, I'm not going on any heritage tours until something changes in Lithuania. Believe me, that will be very effective. I'm also against sending children to Poland to see the concentration camps, because Poland is no better than Lithuania. And I think we should be boycotting all cool tours of Poland and concentration camps that fund their economy until the disgusting things going on in Lithuania and Poland and Latvia have to change. And I think Jews can vote with their pocketbooks, and that's what I recommend that you all do.
Going back to the book, it's funny. One of the questions just raised in the chat was a question that I had. The first, I would say, 100 pages or so of the book deal with what I call the upheaval in Milia's marriage. And was that a purposeful choice in when you wrote the book, to sort of set a stage for later things happening in the book, or was it just something that evolved?
You know, when you write a book, you create characters. And I don't know about other writers, but this is what I do. I create a character, and that character starts to live its own life. It talks to me. It tells me things I didn't expect. things I didn't know about. I remember once Tolstoy said that he was absolutely shocked when Vronsky tried to kill himself. Now, a lot of people think that's crazy. How could Tolstoy be shocked by what one of his characters did? But I absolutely understand that. You can't know if the character is living. It's a living creation that has a life of its own. You can't know what's going to happen. I didn't expect this. I didn't know this was going to happen. When she's sitting on the couch and she gets that phone call, and I'm not going to tell my prospective readers what she hears in that phone call, I did not know what was going to happen. I really did not know. I was as surprised as she was, honestly speaking. But I had to go with that because to me, the minute you say, no, this doesn't fit into my plot, it's called putting your thumb on the scale. When an author says, no, 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 I don't want to do this. I have other plans. Then already the character is not alive. The character's wooden. You're creating the character. But when the character is living, doing surprising things, and surprising things happen to this character, that's a living human being. And I think when you read this book, you see that these characters are living. The unusual things happen to them, things you didn't expect, and they have feelings that come along, which seem to be the feelings of real people. So I went with that. I went with that flow, and in the end, I think it did fit into what I was trying to do because she was in the midst of this relationship that was going through turmoil with her spouse, and it convinced her to go off to Lithuania, and her meeting with this Professor Darius Vidas, who himself is divorced and very good looking and very kind and very intelligent and very supportive. I think it created an emotional dynamic between them, which fit into what I was trying to say and which fit into the narrative of the story, which is two people from completely opposite sides of the world going from antagonism and complete rejection to some kind of human relationship, which turns into something even more, something which becomes intimate. And so in the end, your brain is telling you something, your subconscious is telling you something that you wouldn't have planned. But in the end, it all fits in. So this worked out perfectly for what I was trying to say. The alienation from her roots and from her husband and from all these things fit in perfectly to the situation she found herself.
It did. And it was another loss, right? It was another type of loss in her life. Um, so the other question I have, which we talked about earlier, is how did you get started in writing? Right? You had degrees, you were a mother, and at some point in your life, you started writing novels. How did that happen?
Well, I was always going to be a writer because when I was in third grade, I lived in a low-income housing project. It was very scary to go down the steps, to go outside. So I spent a lot of my time as a little Jewish girl upstairs in my room reading books. And I was sent to an Orthodox Hebrew day school, and I developed a wonderful vocabulary from all these books I was reading. And so when I had to ask, in those days you were asked to write what they called compositions. So I wrote compositions, and I had these amazing handle on a huge number of words that most third graders don't have. And I had a wonderful teacher, Mrs. Gross, God bless her, and Mrs. Rosen, God bless her, who wrote on all my compositions, "You're going to be a writer. You're such a wonderful writer." And she told my mother I was going to be a writer. So from a very early age, my teachers, God bless them, put this idea into my head. And also, when my compositions were read out loud to the class, they laughed and they clapped and they enjoyed it. And this was something that gave me tremendous encouragement from very early age. Now, at the beginning, nobody gets a job as a novelist. You get a job as a freelance writer, you get a degree in English, and then you get a job writing for government ministries. You can be a freelance writer for the newspaper. And that's what I did when I moved to Israel in 1971. I worked for the Jerusalem Post. I worked for the Ministry of Environment, writing about activated sludge and air pollution and water pollution. And this was not what I dreamed of. And after I had my fourth child, um, I said to my husband, look, I've got to hire a babysitter for this kid anyway. So if I go back to work, I'll only get half salary. So give me a fellowship. Give me a certain amount of time not to work. And I'm going to try to write my first novel. So my husband always says it was the best investment he ever made, certainly better than any stock market investment. So he invested in me. I didn't go to work, and my baby would get up um, at 5 o'clock in the morning and take a bottle, and then we'd go back to sleep. And he wouldn't get up till 12. And so I had between 5 and 12 to write my book. And it was like very, very strict because I had the kids coming back from school. I had three other kids, and they were coming back from school after 12 o'clock. So I had exactly that amount of time to work on my first novel, which was Justice Daughter. And I had the idea. It was an idea that I got from a true story that happened to my neighbor. And so I didn't have to do any research. I knew all about the ultra Orthodox world. I was a religious woman. I lived in that world. So I wrote that book. And at the end of the year, I had my first novel. Um, and so that's how I began. I mean, the story of how I sold it and what happened to it. I mean, it's like a fairy tale, but it worked out well. God was with me, and from then on, I never looked back, and I never wrote another book without having a signed contract. So there was never a case of my looking for a publishing house for my next book. Since that first book was published, I always had a publishing house that I had a signed contract with that was going to publish my next book. And that has been true of every single one of my 13 books that I've written since then. So I had an assured income, and I had an assured publication contract. So um, I never looked back, and I always thank my youngest child, Akiva, for being a good sleeper and for not waking up before 12 o'clock and ruining my writing time. And I thank him to this day.
Have you dedicated a book to him?
I should really. I think I did dedicate one book to four of my children.
How long did it take you to write your first book? How long in terms of time?
Book took me exactly a year
That's
because
amazing.
that was the deal I had with my husband. He gave me a year off. So I didn't have any wiggle room here. I said I was going to do it, and I had a year to do it, and I had to do that in a year. And when I write a book, this is what I do. I have a contract. I tell them when I'm going to finish this book, and then I sign that contract, and they give me money. And then I am contractually obligated to finish that book on that date. So I take a calendar and I write down when the book is due. And then I write down how many pages every day I have to write in order to have my 380, 400 pages by that time. And I keep track every day of have I written my pages or haven't I written my pages? And am I on schedule or aren't I on schedule? And I have never, ever missed a deadline. And I'm usually a month early, which I know is not it's not really something most writers do. Most
Yeah.
writers get drunk, they go out to bars, they tell you they have writer's block and they can't think. But if you're a mother and you're a religious woman and you don't drink and you don't go out to bars and you have limited amount of time because you have to take care of your four kids and you have to bake your challah for Shabbat, you use the time that you have wisely and you invest it in the work that you're contractually obligated to do. So I never understand people who come up with these excuses why they took the money and they can't finish the book. I honestly, it goes beyond me. I can't understand that.
Were you able to keep to that same kind of time schedule with this book, which clearly involved a lot more research and factual and historical documentation? Did this one take
Well,
you longer?
I didn't promise to do this book in less than 2 years. That was my contract. And actually, for The Ghost of Hannah Mendez, it took me 5 years to do the research for that book. I didn't put a word down until I had finished researching the Spanish Inquisition and Sephardic history and Sephardic customs, and that took me 5 years. With this book, say the research only took me a year, but that was concentrated effort, that was concentrated research. And I have to say that I have gotten a lot of praise for the accuracy of this book. Dr. Zuroff took, I gave the book to vet to him after I had finished it, and he was absolutely, he told me he was flabbergasted at how accurate this book was and how much research I had put into it. And I have gotten that same reaction from a lot of Holocaust scholars and other people. And I say that I did this research faithfully because I don't think that you should make things up. Even if the book is a work of fiction, if you're writing about the Holocaust, as I said in my speech, it's a sacred trust. There's so many things that you can make up and fictionalize, but you can't do that to the Holocaust because people are always saying, oh, it's not true and you're exaggerating. So you must never, ever do that. And so everything that I say in this book is 1000% researched and 1000% true. In my acknowledgments, I make it very clear what part of this book is fiction and what part is absolutely true. Everything I say about the experiences of the Holocaust survivors were taken from first person notarized testimony of Lithuanian Holocaust survivors that were collected in this volume of books, a book called The Lithuanian Slaughter of Its Jews, which just, I think, a year or two ago was translated from Yiddish into English, and it's made available to the public now. And I was very lucky to get a copy of it. And I did not change anything. I edited it for, perhaps length, but everything that these stories say happened. I used the exact names of the people that are talking about the story, the locations, the fact, everything is exactly what happened. I did not make anything up. This is not fictionalized. Unlike the story of Milia and Darius, who are obviously fictionalized characters, and even they are based on real people. But I think I made it very clear what part of this is fact and what part of this is fiction.
If you read the acknowledgments, you do. You're very clear
Yes.
about it. Um, in your book, Darius's families, not his, but his I think it's his grandfather, right? His grandfather's town is listed as with a capital J and then blank for the rest of for the rest of the name, and
The
then later,
mayor, he's listed as the mayor of J with a dash,
right?
not putting in the name of the city. And I did that deliberately because Darius is a made up character, and so his grandfather is a made up character. And so, if I want to say that crimes were committed in a certain town by Darius's grandfather, obviously I can't give the name of a real town because all of this is fictionalized. I can't attribute crimes to a real city in Lithuania, and so I use the J dash so as not to confuse real cities with made up cities. And I did this because I was meticulous about separating fact from fiction. When I write about the Holocaust events that the survivors talk about, I give the names of the towns. I don't put any dashes in. That is the only place in the book where I don't identify the town, and that is the reason.
That's a great. I'm glad for the. Thank you for that explanation. One of the questions from the chat that I think you'll like is, were you ever able to tell those teachers who you just talked to us about today, were you able to tell them how much they encouraged you and what an impact they had on your life?
Wow. I thought about that the other day, and obviously I doubt any of them are still around, and I wouldn't know how to get in touch with them if they were. Um, but I think that they knew. I think that as a student in those classes, they knew what a difficult life I had. My father had just passed away. My mother was very poor. We were living from hand to mouth. I was a scholarship student. And they saw how important it was to encourage me in something that I was good at. And, I was surrounded by little girls in beautiful little one family homes in the five towns in Rockaway, from well-to-do families. And I think they saw this as a way to help me, um, to gain self-confidence and to overcome a lot of my problems. And I think they did appreciate that. And I remember they had a contest for book reports. You got a medal for how many book reports you did. And I remember I used to read books for, just voraciously. And I used to write these, one sentence book reports, and I wrote 50 of them, and they gave me this beautiful little medal. So I think that they went out of their way to give me medals and to give me prizes and to encourage me. And I also think I deserved it because I really was a great writer, even in third grade. I can tell you that because I still have some of those
I was going
copies.
to ask whether you still had your composition books. I was sure
I
the
had a
answer was going
great
to be yes.
I had a great imagination, and that's something you're born with. Nobody can do that for you. You can, and I would say to everybody out there, do not waste your money on a fine arts degree if you want to be a writer. It is a total waste of money. No one is going to teach you how to be a writer. If you're a writer, it's in your soul, it's in your gut. You can get a degree in English, you can learn words, you can read books, but no one's going to teach you how to be a writer. You either have it or you don't have it. And that's something you're born with. So I think it's a gift. And I think that everyone who's born with that gift, they know it. And I think it's their obligation to develop it, to nurture it, and to use it well, and to write about important things.
That's fabulous. One last question. Um, I thought you had said earlier that you did go to Lithuania, but there's been a question in the chat whether you went to Lithuania to do your research.
I wound up in Lithuania years before I ever had the idea for this book because I was going to write a book about the first Hebrew woman
Right.
novelist,
That's
and
what
her
you were
name
talking
was Sarah Foner. And she was born in Lithuania. She had a very interesting life, a very interesting and tragic story. And I said, you know what? I can't write this story if I don't go to Lithuania. So I went to Lithuania. I went to Vilnius. I took a tour. I honestly didn't know what I was seeing. I did not understand what I was seeing when I was in Lithuania. I sensed that there was something there that was not right. There was an antagonism. There was an antagonism to our Jewish group. There was some kind of undercurrent that a person feels that things are not right. And then, of course, I went out to Ponary, where there are massive Jewish graves, where all the Jews of Vilnius were taken on trucks to Ponary and they were shot. And you go out there and you see these mass graves with markers as far as the eye can see, and it's something that you can't get your head around, that many deaths and those many people that were killed. So I visited Lithuania before I had this knowledge, but I took this with me when I wrote the book. I took the feelings that I had and the descriptions of Vilnius and the descriptions of how I felt going to a mass gravesite. Um, I didn't have to go back. It stayed with me. And so fortuitously, that's the way it worked out.
And that's where you saw the grave that like was um the stone that was built underneath something else that popped up while you were sitting there, is it?
That was not in Ponary. In Ponary, it's very deep. I was this was unexpected because I was sitting in a park across from the Jewish quarter. And it was green grass and it was trees, and you're sitting on a park bench and it just rained. And all of a sudden, I see this white headstone peeking out of the ground. And as it's raining, it's getting higher and higher. And you realize that this is a gravestone that has been um, earthed over to create this park. And that I found as a metaphor for all of Lithuania.
And you described that in the book very the exact same way as you were discussing it today orally,
Yeah,
and it was amazing. It's the same story. So, yeah. So you did go to Lithuania, but not for the research, to see something else.
yeah.
I have no other questions. Susan, Neil, anything? Thank you so much. But
Thank you very much for having me. And listen, if anybody is interested in what's going on in Israel, I suggest I write a daily diary on what's happening in the war in Gaza. And if you go to my website, www.naomireagan.com, you can read my daily dispatches on what's happening in Israel and what's happening in Gaza. You can also write to me if you have questions that come up after you read my book, and I'm happy to answer your questions. So I hope that we'll be in touch. Thank you very much. Everybody
Thank you. Thank you.
have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
everyone. I'm putting the link to our website in the chat for our next program. And I wanted to again thank you all for spending this time with us. And I wish you all a very nice day. Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.
Stop recording.